we will talk about what is HACCP and what are the 7 principles of HACCP and what are the prerequisites to implement HACCP in food industry. So what is HACCP? Hazard Analysis Critical Control Points. It is a systematic preventive approach to food safety. It's science-based and it identifies and controls potential hazards. These hazards could be physical, chemical, or biological. From raw material to production, these hazards could be present, could be entering, and the idea is to identify these hazards and control them so that they do not risk food safety. For HACCP to be, let me talk a little bit about the history of HACCP, not too much. HACCP was developed by Pillsbury for producing food for NASA astronauts. And later on, it was expanded to general food. In fact, in 1998, Canada made it mandatory for the fish plants to have HACCP, but the regulations were slightly different provincially. In 2005, Canada made it mandatory for all meat and poultry plants as well, federally regulated. In recent years, Canada has passed a new law, that is Safe Food for Canadian Act and its regulations. Under this law, HACCP principles have been embedded, but they're not called HACCP as such. They're called preventive controls and preventive control plans. PCP, which is essentially same as HACCP. It's not much different. So any business that comes under the jurisdiction of this law must have preventive controls in place, and those who do business, they have revenue more than $100,000 a year, they must have a written HACCP plan. So for HACCP to be successful, we must recognize that some prerequisites have to be met. What are these prerequisites? Good manufacturing practices must be there. That means the food must be prepared with proper hygiene, right? Personnel hygiene. The facility should be maintained well. People should be properly trained, should be carrying out the procedures properly, and so on and on. So that basic good manufacturing practices must be there. There should be standard operating procedures. That means if you are, let's say, making a syrup, what is the procedure of making syrup? What is the proportion of sugar? What are you using any preservatives and so on? So what temperature are you cooking it at? How long you're cooking it for, and so on and on. So that is standard operating procedure. You can call it a recipe, but it is more beyond that. It's proper procedures to create your product. Then there is sanitation standard operating procedures, that how will you sanitize? You must have a written plan that this is how we sanitize, this is how often we sanitize, with what, that must be there. Allergen control program should be there. Pest control program should be there. Or if you are preparing a food that doesn't have allergens in it, then how do you prevent cross-contamination? That plan should be there. How do you ensure that there are no pests in your facility, there are no mice, and there are no flies flying there? Personnel hygiene policies must be in place, and people should be trained. So these are essentially part of good manufacturing practices as well. So this is prerequisite. Without having this in place, HACCP cannot be successful. So what are the 7 principles of HACCP? The first principle is conduct a hazard analysis. Identify potential hazards in food production process. What are the hazards? A hazard is something that has a potential to cause harm. So there could be biological hazards, chemical or physical hazards. Biological, such as bacteria, viruses, parasites, fungi, mold. Chemical could be pesticides, could be allergens, cleaning agents, antibiotics, or whatever. Physical could be a piece of glass, metal pieces, anything that is not supposed to be there, physical substance that is not supposed to be there. That could be hazardous. So throughout your process, right from receiving the material, raw material, to the production, product finishing, you have a process flow. So create a process flow diagram, and at each step in the process, identify what biological hazards could be there, what physical hazards could be there, what chemical hazards could be there in your process. That is the first principle. And this is, in fact, probably the most important step of HACCP, that you have to identify the hazards. Okay? Assess their risk and severity. That is part of it. So risk is a combination of how much harm something can cause and how often it will occur. So this is a risk assessment matrix. What is the severity? How much harm can a hazard cause? It could be mild, maybe a mild illness, or it could be serious, where it could cause hospitalization, or it could be severe, where it could be, a person getting permanently disabled, or even death. How likely it happens? Is it unlikely to happen? Rare? Possible? Has occurred in the past? Or likely when it occurs frequently? It is a frequent issue. You create this matrix, and where the risk is high, here, 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 then it must be controlled in the HACCP plan. So the second principle is identify critical control points. For that, what is a critical control point? A step is considered a CCP if it is deemed essential to prevent, eliminate, or reduce a hazard to an acceptable level. If this step is necessary to remove a hazard or reduce it to an acceptable level, then that is called CCP. How do you decide a step is a CCP in your process? Think about, first of all, what might be necessary. Let's say you are making a burger. So what step is there that will kill bacteria? Because bacteria are hazards in meat, and you do not want those to survive for food safety. So what step is necessary to destroy those bacteria? Obviously, it is cooking. So that step has to be a CCP. You're processing milk. There is a step in the milk that will ensure that the most bacteria are destroyed, and that step is pasteurization. Right? So those are critical steps. Or you are receiving supplies, some material, and there could be metal in that. Right? That is a hazard. Do you have a step existing in your process that will ensure that that metal piece doesn't get into your food? Well, you may put a metal detector. That would become a CCP. Or you're controlling the pH for preventing Clostridium botulinum. That could be a CCP. Okay. So what is the decision tree that we use to determine if a particular point in a process is a CCP? That decision tree is given by Codex Alimentarius. So let's look at that decision tree. This is an example of a decision tree. There are more, but this is probably the best. Here you ask a question for every hazard in the process. Do control do preventive control measures exist at this step? If yes, then ask another question. Is the step specifically designed to eliminate or reduce the likely occurrence of a hazard at this at an acceptable level, to an acceptable level? So first of all, do control measures exist? For example, we are cooking the burger. At that step cooking, obviously we are cooking it, so there is a control measure that is existing there, cooking step, heating, right? Then ask, is the step specifically designed to eliminate or reduce the likely occurrence of a hazard? We are cooking the burger to kill bacteria, right? So if you say yes, then it is a critical control point. That step is designed to kill bacteria, so that is a critical control point. If your answer was no, for example, when you are receiving meat and you're putting in the storage, in the freezer or cold storage, is that step designed to kill bacteria? No, that step is not designed to kill bacteria. That is to control the growth of bacteria, but not really to kill it, right? Or to reduce it to an acceptable level. Then ask next question. Could contamination with identified hazards occur in excess of acceptable level, or could these increase to unacceptable level? Now in the storage, is this step, even if it is not killing the bacteria, could the bacteria grow here? They could, right? If the temperature is not correct, then the bacteria could grow. If the answer is yes, you ask the next question. But the answer is no, then it is not a CCP. So if answer is yes, in case of refrigeration or freezer, where if the temperature is not controlled, then bacteria can grow. Will a subsequent step eliminate identified hazards or reduce likely occurrence to acceptable level? Is there a later step that will actually eliminate that hazard? We're not wanting it to multiply, but there is a later step, that is cooking, that will eliminate the bacteria. If there is a later step, then it is not a CCP. But if there is no later step, this was the step where it should have been controlled, then this is a critical control point, right? If the answer to the first question, do preventive control measures exist? Let's say, do we have an X-ray, a metal detector? No. Is control at this step necessary for safety? And you say, oh yeah, there could be metal in the food and that could be hazardous. So we actually should have a metal detector. We should eliminate that metal. If the answer is yes, then modify your process or product. That means now maybe it is time to consider having a metal detector. Okay. If it is not necessary, it is not a CCP, you can stop right there. So for every hazard, you have to ask, at every step of your process, you have to ask use this decision tree to determine if a particular step in a process is a CCP. Now, in a regular process, typically there would be 1, 2, or 3 critical control points. You do not want too many critical control points. Now, another thing that is very important for a critical control point to have is that it should be measurable. Because what you're doing with critical control point, you're saying, okay, this step is a CCP, let's say cooking the burger. It's a CCP, obviously. So we are saying that this burger should be cooked to an internal temperature if it is not cooked to that internal temperature, then the burger cannot go to the next step, right? That is packaging or whatever the next step is. It cannot move on to the next step. That means this step is a check post. If you pass it, only then you can go beyond it. If you fail the test, you cannot move on. So that means it has to be measurable. You should be able to measure. What are you measuring? You're measuring the internal temperature. That means you must define what is the correct temperature when it passes versus when it doesn't pass. For example, chicken must be cooked to 74 degrees Celsius or higher. So you say, okay, did the internal temperature reach 74 degrees Celsius? If yes, it can move on. If no, it cannot move on. Or cooling must reach below 4 degrees Celsius within 4 hours. Leftover food, metal detector sensitivity must detect anything greater than 2 millimeter metal fragment, right? So these are some examples of establishing the limit. But you have to be able to measure what you are controlling. Then you have to monitor it. That means now somebody needs to measure it. So you need to have a proper plan. How often, how many samples will be measured? Are you going to measure every burger's internal temperature? Are you doing 4 burgers per batch or so on? Who is doing that? How are they doing it? Are the SOPs provided? And so on. So that plan needs to be in place. The next principle is establish corrective actions. Define actions to be taken if critical limits are exceeded or did not meet. So if our burgers should reach, our chicken should reach 74 degrees Celsius, right, internal temperature, but if it doesn't, let's say it read 71 degrees Celsius, that means it did not meet the criteria. What will you do? What is your corrective action? So that should be written down as well. Will you recook it? Will you discard it? That should be written in your plan. The next is verification of a HACCP system. When I say verification, remember, validation has to be done first, then you verify. So your HACCP plan should be validated. That means it does what it's supposed to do. So is the internal temperature correct? Is that the temperature that it should be? Will that temperature eliminate or reduce the bacteria to the acceptable level or not? First validate that. Once your plan is validated, then you must verify that it is being done. There is no point verifying an invalid plan, right? So it has to be valid, but once it is valid, then you must verify that it is actually being done the way it is supposed to be done. So reviewing the monitoring records, see was the internal temperature checked for every batch as it was supposed to? Was the microbiological testing done? Perform internal audits. And finally, establish record keeping and documentation. This is a step that is often ignored because it's time consuming to record things, to keep data. But this is actually extremely important. This is, again, one of the most important steps. The first one was very important. The last one is very important. All are important, but these are often not done properly. So you should have your HACCP analysis report created, CCP monitoring logs should be there, corrective action reports. Something did not work right, you had to take a corrective action. Did you record what happened? What was the temperature, for example, 71 degrees Celsius? And then what did you do? Did you recook it? Did you throw it away? Right? All that reporting should be done. And if you had to change something, let's say you had to change a thermostat. Did you verify that the new installed thermostat actually worked well? That verification was important. So that record keeping is extremely important. So that's essentially what HAZUP 7 principles are.